Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Honorable Anthony Fox, Secretary of Transportation of the United States, to moderate a discussion on innovative approaches to infrastructure investing with the Honorable John Hickenlooper, Governor of Colorado, Mr. Bill Banks, Global Infrastructure Leader of Ernst & Young, Mr. Nicholas Rubio de Cardenas, U.S. President of Cintra, Mr. Christopher Leslie, CEO of Macquarie Infrastructure Partners, Incorporated.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you and also thank the U.S. Department of Commerce for holding this incredible convention. And let me introduce our panel once again. To my direct left, John Hickenlooper, Governor of Colorado.
Coloradans.
We have Coloradans here today. Bill Blanks, Ernst & Young, Australia. Chris Leslie from Macquarie Infrastructure Partners. And Nicholas Rubio, U.S. President of Cintra.
Thank you.
And folks, we're here because the U.S. infrastructure is screaming for investment. The United States is on track to underinvest in transportation to the tune of about $1 trillion by the end of the decade. This is happening at a time when demand is increasing. 70 million more people will be in the U.S. by 2040. We'll have to move 45% more freight. And so we know that part of the answer here is robust federal funding. There's no substitute for it. But we also know that the private sector, including investors from around the world, have a role to play here in the U.S. So here today, we're here to talk about how investors can play a role in building that infrastructure out. Now, I was a mayor not too long ago, so I know that there may be a blueprint for how to physically build a bridge or a transit system. But there is no single blueprint for building the invisible infrastructure that makes our actual infrastructure possible, the financing, the permitting, the regulations. And this is why the administration has stood up something called the Build America Transportation Investment Center. This center will be a one-stop shop for infrastructure financing. Everyone from state and local governments to private developers and, more importantly, international investors will be able to contact us to find out what financing models might work best for them and which programs we offer at DOT that may suit their needs. I might point out that among other things last year, our TIFIA program had a record year, dispensing $7.5 billion out of a $10 billion allocation last year, and we look forward to doing a lot more. But today I want to build on this work and cover several topics. What opportunities exist for 3Ps in the U.S., how investors can partner with project sponsors at the state and local level, and as I mentioned, why robust federal funding is crucial to making all this happen. So let's jump into the conversation. And I want to start with you, Governor Hickenlooper. You are the governor of a wonderful state. You are also the mayor of a wonderful city in Denver. And you've had lots of great successes with public-private partnerships in both roles. And I'd like to know a little bit of the Colorado story here. What has made it successful? Give us a view from the bench on some of the projects you've done, and tell us how you're able to get it done, and particularly when you hit a pothole, so to speak, in moving things forward, how did you move over that pothole?
Sure. So, and before I even thought of ever running for office, Metro Denver realized they were strangling on their own growth, and a lot of the civic leaders were concerned. I got elected mayor of Denver in 2003, and we were well into imagining what a transit solution would look like that would really simplify people's lives, reduce a lot of the congestion and waiting times. We sold it to all the mayors around the metro area. At that time, there were 34 mayors. And in the end, it was a 0.4% sales tax increase, so the largest one-time increase And it was over the entire metro area, not just the city and county of Denver's in the center. It's about 20% of the total population and maybe a little more of that of the area. Anyway, to make a long story short, we got all 34 mayors, 2/3 of them were Republicans, 1/3 Democrats, to unanimously support a 0.4 cent sales tax, really by going around and demonstrating that even if the light rail line didn't come to their community, their citizens were driving in the same traffic on the arterials and the main connectors. They were running in the same delays and losing the same part of their day as everyone else was, and they would reap the benefit. That in essence, we were providing a bribe, as it were. No, I shouldn't use that word in a room like this. They're providing an incentive for people to get out of their cars and get out of the way of the people in their constituencies. So we passed that 55-45, got going on fast tracks in 2004, and of course, right about then, as commodity prices skyrocketed, all manner of challenges came. We had the Great Recession began in 2008, and they were really upside down for a period of time there. We weren't sure how we would get. The main hub of this was Union Station, this big old 100-year-old station in the center of the city that was going to be the connector for everything. And in the end, we did a public-private partnership where we went out and used TIFIA and RIF, put together, I think, roughly $600 million or a little less than that of what it became an almost $1 billion project. But we committed the increase in property tax revenues to pay for this station. And we, as you can imagine, we tried to be transparent from the very beginning. We were in every way you could be transparent. And yet we still got a lot of pushback from, like so many people they're just resistant. They feel that somehow when private enterprise is involved in a project like this, that somehow they're sneaking something past them. And they thought that we were giving away too much, that the growth wouldn't be there, that the taxpayer would be at risk. Well, we put the station in. We could not have financed it without the Department of Transportation, but without these partnerships. And now the development around that station is so far beyond what anyone, it's beyond our best case scenario. So we will pay off the bonds that were part of this kind of group of investment. I think last thing I saw, I think it was 6 years in advance of what we anticipated. And you keep walking to that station now, and it is one of the most exciting places in the whole state of Colorado. We look at the line now to the airlines, a public-private partnership. We've seen huge benefits by the competitive bidding of just finding efficiencies and reductions in costs that have helped us get not back to where we wanted to be in 2004, but we've recovered a lot of that lost ground, which I don't think we could have done without that public-private partnership.
Wow. So that's a great story. We've got investors here who look at the U.S. landscape and understand it fairly well. I want to first of all ask you, when you look at the U.S. market, where do you see opportunities? And what kinds of opportunities do you think we are not achieving because we are underutilizing public-private partnerships?
Well, if I might start, Mr. Secretary, I think there's opportunities across a very wide spectrum, and with respect to your great Department of Transport, it extends well beyond transportation. I think the Build America initiative in transportation is a fantastic first step on a road which will encompass sectors beyond transportation, water, etc. The other thing to bear in mind, obviously, from a foreign investor's perspective, is that a lot of the infrastructure in the United States isn't necessarily in public hands. It was in private hands from the beginning. So, the utility industry here has always been private. Energy presents tremendous opportunities. But I think your question's specifically on the public side of things. And so I think taking the lead from the Build America initiative, what we'd hope to see would be the replication of that model throughout various states, and we already see it in Virginia and Florida and Texas and elsewhere, where state and local agencies develop an expertise in interacting with the private sector and then open the doors to a range of investment. So I think while there's been a range of success, particularly in highways, airports stand as a very obvious example for private investment. I think Denver's taking some tentative steps at the Denver airport with the private sector. But when you think of airports internationally, obviously Sydney Airport, close to my own heart, London's Heathrow Airport is privately operated by Nicholas's company. This isn't such a huge leap, and they're very ripe for private investment.
Nicholas or Bill, I don't know.
Yes, I would add that really the US market, it's 50 different markets. So that's probably a challenge.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, 50 different states, each state with its own legislation. This is why it's so important to have a governor here in the panel. Out of those 50, 34 have a PPP enabling legislation. I think beyond that, there is a need in the market for investment in infrastructure. It's not only the different figures that are normally used of $1 trillion need in infrastructure, but on an annual basis, users are expending in overtime and over gas over $120 billion just in sitting in traffic. So there is a need there. I think also the US Department of Transportation has excellent tools to help these investments materializing. The TIFIA loans you referred to before, the Center of Excellence that you are now setting. And also I think at the state level, there is a strong willingness and readiness to hear new ideas and innovation. So I think all those things together are making that more and more states are looking at this as a solution. In the past, as Chris has mentioned, we've seen it in Texas, in Florida, in Virginia. We are now, Colorado certainly, we are now looking at Massachusetts doing things, Pennsylvania, California, and some other, so it's really expanding. North Carolina.
Heard of that place?
I would just add to what my colleagues have said as well, is we have to be careful that you don't beat yourselves up too much. We are spending the $300 billion in the Infrastructure Restoration Fund, so there's a lot of infrastructure investment going here. I think where the US is fortunate in a sense that you do have that public alternative to the public funding through your own department and through the states themselves. So that's a competitive source of financing. So there is opportunities for the private sector to participate in that market. But I think on the getting more P3s, and I'm someone who spends my life advising clients on P3, so I'm a P3 advocate, if you like. I think what needs to happen in the US, and we're fortunate with the governor here and yourself and the president yesterday, is that we need more political champions to have the courage to actually come out and say politically that we believe in P3s and we'll take them to the electorate. Because until you get that support from the electorate, you're not going to get the person in the street wanting to pay the extra taxes or the user charges to actually justify the infrastructure. Because unfortunately, it is not a free good. People are comfortable, as we heard, paying for private utility bills, private health care. But when it comes to infrastructure, there seems to be a standby. We need to get the people over that burden. And there needs to be a charm offensive, if you like, by the infrastructure industry to say, our infrastructure is good for you. By investing in infrastructure, we're creating wider economic benefits along the transport corridors, along some of the Denver station example, where you've created a hub, the property taxes. That would never have happened without the investment in infrastructure. So we really do need to win the people over, that this is a good thing. And clearly, all projects won't be successful, but if we all champion it, we can make sure we select the projects that have the right attributes to be successful as a P3, and leave the public money to do the more difficult or challenging projects that are not as acceptable or deliverable as a P3 option.
I think that's a really good point, and I think maybe that's a good place for us to maybe have a little more conversation, because let's say you've identified a great project, you've got political leadership that's willing to step up to the plate.
Yeah.
Are there certain things that the private sector can do as part of working through a deal to create the space for the public to find acceptance? And what's the public role, what's the private role? Governor, you can start.
Well, I think the trick here is to keep it simple enough so you can communicate the vision to a large cross-section of your population, and you've got to let people, I think there's a lot of anxiety throughout America. The challenges the middle class has faced over the last 20 years, and the president's referred to this again and again, but it's real. People aren't sure they're going to get a raise. People aren't sure that their life is getting better than it was 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. So they want to know what's in it for them. And I think part of that vision is you've got to communicate, whether you're building a light rail system or adding a lane onto a highway, that you're transparent and that you're fair. In other words, that people are going to get what they paid for, and that it's going to have a real value to the community beyond just the frequency with which that individual voter might use that piece of infrastructure. People talk, Colorado and Denver especially, Denver for the last 6 years has been one of the, either first or second as the destination for millennials, young professionals coming out of school, like kind of 18 to 34-year-olds. We've been either first or second as a destination for millennials each year, and our infrastructure has been a big part of it, right? So many of the young people don't want to have 2 cars in a 2-person family. They want to have 1 car, or maybe even no cars. They want to have a system of transit that works. They want to have opportunities to get around without always having to be stuck in traffic. Making those investments in an innovative way, whether it's a bridge or a highway or transit, dramatically changes how people think about your city. And I'd argue this, not just people always think, well, Denver's close to all that skiing, that's why all those millennials are coming there. No, maybe that's part of it. But I think a lot of it is the quality of life that you can demonstrate and talk about, and as you begin getting some young people coming, we've got a lot of music going on. Well, that's an attraction. But all of it comes, I think, based on what kind of infrastructure you have. You got to paint that picture.
Yeah. So the public sector paints the picture. Does the private sector have a role here? Have you found success with getting the public to buy into what you're trying to do?
They've got to give us the paint. If we're painting the picture, they've got to make sure that they give us the paint.
Well, I was going to say, I think I've lived in New York City now for 15 years and observed a lot of foreign investors come to the States and make certain presumptions about how things are going to work. And certainly if you hail from a parliamentary style of government system, you might think that it's relatively easy to simply declare something to be so and it will happen. And certainly I'm sure there's investors in the room that hail from those sorts of jurisdictions. But it's important in the US to realize that everybody has a voice and everybody participates in the process. And so it's incumbent on the private sector really to engage at every level with every constituency, be it Labour, local community leaders, obviously the politicians and so forth, to ensure that everybody understands what it is that's being done. And you need to take the time and invest the energy to have those communications around these sorts of processes, because if you don't, a voice will come out of the wilderness and cause an issue for you, and you'll have to address it in ways that, I think America has a reputation internationally for being relatively litigious, and so, you can expect to be sued often as an ordinary course matter in America, whereas that would be a dramatic event, elsewhere in the world. Here it's sort of just what you do. And so I think that takes a bit of getting used to.
Yeah, I would maybe add, and supporting that I think probably the most difficult challenge and the key to success is not only political consensus, but beyond that, strong local support. And I do think that, and it's our experience, that private investors can work in that local support, not only through community engaging and devolving to the community part of their investment, but very especially by engaging local suppliers, by engaging local partners. In some of our projects, we have the Dallas Police and Fire pension plan who is investing. We have 300 working hard with DBEs. DBEs, the disadvantaged business enterprises, are a huge opportunity to find niches where companies want to grow and are willing to work and to understand and to adapt themselves to new situations. So I do think the private sector can do things, and if you do those, on the long term, there's success.
Yeah, and I would certainly concur with the Governor and keep it simple. I think what we've found globally, and I don't think you've got it here in the US, and I would certainly actively discourage is encouraging academics. Because if you're relying on academics to make the argument in favour of P3, you might as well stop now, because we've seen so many papers on risk transfer, value for money, public sector comparators, etc., and that's just going to turn the average person off. They're not going to engage in that. So what, as the Governor said, what you've got to do is have the private sector fully engaged with the public sector to show the value of the infrastructure investment that's been made, so they can actually see that the quality of their commute will improve, the time of their commute. If it's an education establishment, the school that their children will go to now is better quality, there's a chance of greater education attainment, similarly in other sort of social infrastructure. So you actually show the value add that by doing a P3 with that public-private partnership can actually get a much more sustainable and long-term solution, because that's the real benefits of PPP, really, is you're entering into a 30-year concession where someone is responsible for maintaining that facility, upgrading it as he goes to make sure it's fit for purpose today and it's fit for purpose in 30 years. So you really do need to win that argument and show that value, not relying on risk transfer, value for money, because that's just hocus pocus. I do it for a living and I know it's hocus pocus, so academics make a lot of money out of it, but it really is focusing on core values. And I think the other thing, as you said about drawing the picture, I think we should be at the same easel and draw the picture together. So I think that's where you get a lot of the value, is where the private sector and the public sector co-develop the solution. And I think I read something you said earlier in the year about transport-orientated developments.
Yes.
Get the real estate in the private sector together with the public sector, because you might actually build a railway depot, but you might build a whole lot of infrastructure around it that can actually offset the cost. But if you just put out a rail station as a project, you won't get the benefit of that additional value capture at the outset. So co-develop the solution at the beginning, paint the picture, and then you can colour it in together too with a sort of mixed-use development. So I think much greater engagement with the private sector to enable them to get their message across, but make sure that these guys here, because I'm on your side typically, make sure these guys work for their money and work for the concession, because what you are giving them is, you're giving them a 30-year concession. They need to demonstrate that they're going to give you value for 30 years. It's not something to give away lightly. They've got to work for it. Sorry, guys.
You know, I'm going to switch gears for a little bit, because one of the differences, and I spend my days thinking about transportation. There are obviously lots of other infrastructure types of projects out there, but there's an awful lot of public infrastructure out there in the transportation space. When you involve private actors in building that infrastructure, they have a different set of incentives and are highly incentivized towards efficiency. What do private-public partnerships have to teach us about efficiency? Nicholas, I want to start with you on that.
Yes, I think the best way to address that question is probably to refer to an existing example. In the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, we are developing now 3 managed lanes projects, improvement of highways, basically building additional lanes on very congested highways and getting user fees for use of those additional lanes, and with that funding the whole reconstruction. And it's a $5.5 billion investment, all in all. Now, the interesting thing is that through all these private initiatives, through the industry review process that the public administration organized with the state and the federal government, we were able altogether to achieve savings of 27% over the initial expectations in terms of investment. So through modifications to the project to increase capacity, to make it more attractive to users, through finding more efficient technical solutions, through more efficient financing, combining all those different things, we were able to achieve that 27%. So it does provide a big opportunity of efficiencies, and unfortunately too many times, and that's not your case, in America you hear people focusing on funding, and not so much on efficient spending. And I think this is one of the things that the private sector brings, and a key element for all those in the room thinking in investing in America is that there is an openness to hear new ideas and to be efficient. And that local support and political support is going to be strongly supported by efficiencies. If you are able to lower the dollar amount, then everyone is going to be willing to hear what you have to say. That's our experience.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd also, I mean, Nicholas has just been talking about efficiencies principally in terms, I think, of construction cost. One example close to Governor Hickenlooper's heart, I imagine, is the Eagle P3 project, which was a mass transit project in the Denver area. And while the private sector there was able to bid a project cost which was lower, engaging with the private sector also enabled certain efficiencies in the ongoing operation of that particular project, whereby if the trains don't run on time, then the private sector gets penalised for that. And I think that's a sort of device that governments can't internalise. So, the government of Denver saying to its Department of Transport, if you don't run on time, we're going to penalise you, kind of, it's all internalised and doesn't actually create an effective incentive. But where the private sector is involved, you can in fact implement those incentives and those efficiencies.
And I think all I'd really add as well is that, again, under the P3, it's a long-term contract. The private sector run it as a business. They run it for a profit. We in the public sector shouldn't be embarrassed by them making a profit as long as they're delivering a sustainable, high-class quality solution. It's a classic win-win. And that profit incentive means that they do make investment decisions to make it a sustainable solution that meets the expectations of the public sector and the public. It's nothing to be embarrassed about, and if they don't deliver, then, as Nicholas has said, they should be penalised. And they expect to be penalised.
Let me ask another question, which is, how do you find projects? Like, do you just pick up the phone and call 50 governors? Like, what do you do to find projects?
Yeah, you wear out a lot of shoe leather, so you certainly do pick up the phone to governors and so forth, but both here in the US and internationally, also having the imagination and the courage to simply propose something that needs doing. And so an international example, at least in Sydney, there was a dotted line on the proposed freeway map in Sydney, which was the road connecting downtown area with the airport. And so the private sector simply proposed that they would build it, and it sort of went through an auction process and was actually built. When the public sector may have taken decades to in fact have got the funding for that. So seeing opportunities and pursuing them, investing the time and energy to do that is just part of the process.
Governor, in your case, in Denver and Colorado, when you decided you wanted to go the P3 route, did you go out looking for investors? How did you find the private sector partner?
Oh, you don't have to worry about that. Once you decide you want to build something, they seem to find us very quickly. that wasn't the issue. And we didn't, when you say decided to go the PPP route, I mean, private-public partnerships are never going to replace traditional financing for infrastructure, and they're a way to enhance it. And these are incredibly long-term projects that really need to be thought through properly. And in most places in the United States right now, there is this unease, and the public is unwilling to look at just the magnitude of some of these improvements. Whereas I think 50 years ago, this country was embracing those opportunities and building or 60 years ago, a national interstate system, building bridges all over our major waterways. I think private-public partnerships offers a real opportunity to re-engage the public, to take a little of that anxiety off of their plate and saying, all right, we've got a partner in this that really knows what they're doing. And government does many things very, very well, but efficiency has not always been at the top. Although I spent the last several years as governor, and this year as the chair of the National Governors Association, driving efficiencies wherever we can. But it is, to a certain extent, not what many people in government think why they're there. So I think the challenge is to get the public-private partnership members, your participants, your partners, in there as early as you can, because the sooner you can get the high-quality partners like we have here, but the sooner they can get involved in a program, the better vision, the better image you're going to be able to paint of what you're building for the public and why they should really care about it. Because they can't just kind of accept it. You want them to like it. And I think I do think it's going to change over the next few years, and maybe very rapidly, where all of a sudden the public's going to want these things, and they're going to want a lot more private partners to come help them build these things once they kind of get past this this resistance, this anxiety they have.
Yeah, I think building on that, and I don't know if this is where you were going, Secretary, is that, I mean, we've got a fantastic number of investors here in the audience. I think the USA, you can step up in actually your pipeline management of infrastructure projects. And as Nicholas said, you have got 50 states, so you have got 50 markets. So, but I'm not sure if that's a role that Build America could potentially fulfill, or even SelectUSA as a subset of having a pipeline of publicly available information on infrastructure projects over the next 3 to 5 years. Clearly, that'll be subject to business case, political sign-off down the track. But anything you can give the market to create certainty, because we all know an efficient market is one where there's freely available knowledge. And I think that's one of the things that the US market could really benefit from, having a pipeline of projects so that people can then, they might not bid every project, but they can see the projects coming, they can make investment decisions for the long term, they can start matching up with local suppliers or local contractors, forming strategic joint ventures. They can actually position themselves because they believe that there will be a market here for the next 5 to 10 years. I need to get serious as an external investor. Whereas at the moment, I think, as an outsider, it is difficult to see what is a pipeline in the US, even though we know there's a lot of activity, but you have to almost knock on 50 doors to find out what that pipeline is. And clearly, your department controls some of the funding. I'm not sure if that's they have the ability to manage a pipeline, because that's what we have seen, that where you've got an efficient transfer of knowledge, you get a much more sophisticated investor community, and you get people who come here for the long term, not just to come and kick the tires and then go somewhere else. Because the other thing that the US has got to be very aware of, and I'm sure it is very aware of, and events like this are fantastic for bringing attention, but if you go to the Middle East, you go to Africa, you go to Asia, they've all got similar infrastructure investment requirements that we have here. Clearly your market has got an advantage in terms of the ease of doing business, etc. But these emerging markets, they're playing tough too. They'll be offering incentives too. They'll be trying to cajole people to come to their market. So we as the US have to make sure that we position ourselves for success, and that is by providing good quality information to potential investors of the infrastructure projects that are coming. Because physical capital is very mobile. We've got all the Canadian pension money now in Australia. Canada now owns Australia. It's quite bizarre. So physical capital, financial capital is very mobile, and human capital these days isn't far behind it. So we have to be very careful that we position ourselves to be the market of choice. And I think we have got the potential, but anything we can do to help investors make informed decisions would certainly increase that rate of success.
Good.
Maybe I think that every state and every single city in America knows more or less which are the infrastructure projects that they need, and many times I agree with Bill. The challenge is having that single pipeline and a global vision. And I wanted to suggest, Mr. Secretary, that may be a good thing that can be done by the Build America transportation investment team that you're building in your department. I think that is something that would help foreign investors looking at the opportunities, getting them in touch with states. It's something that probably needs to be done.
We are looking at that, by the way, so more news on that, hopefully at some point.
Well, we've talked to the national governors. The Secretary has initiated conversation with the National Governors Association, whether there is in some way that they could serve all the governors at the same time as serving the markets.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think there's in some ways, from an investor's perspective, there's nothing more interesting than a programmatic approach to engaging with the private sector. And so the Build America initiative, embodies all of that in presenting a programmatic approach. But as we know, things happen in America at the state and local level, and so the challenge is to replicate that Build America style initiative in the various states that are looking for that. I'd encourage Colorado to adopt a sort of P3 authority approach to infrastructure procurement as well, because that really gets investors focused, it builds confidence, and it builds the confidence of the private sector to commit the resources that it takes to get these deals done. We've just been successful in New York to rebuild the Goethals Bridge, but that was a 3-year conversation with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. That takes a lot of time and effort and confidence in the system to dedicate those sort of resources to these processes.
Good. So just a couple of rapid fire questions, and then I have a couple of ones to end with. And this is a little flavor of the first question I asked, but are there particular transportation infrastructure projects that lend themselves more to public-private partnerships than others? Or do you see all flavors in the U.S. market?
I think we certainly see all flavors. In terms of the things that are easier, I think bridges and tunnels, the public has a predisposition to pay for those things. Okay, if you've got to cross a bridge, pay a toll, that's not so controversial. If you're going to be tolled for travelling 20 miles of open road, that's more difficult. And so I think bridges and tunnels in particular are probably easier. Within the broader realm, obviously airports I've mentioned previously are also easier.
I would add that I think at the end of the day, the PPP approach is not a substitute of public funding. It's rather a complement. It's an enhancer or a multiplier. So it is better fitted to specific type of projects. At the end of the day, the funding is going to come from either taxes or user fees, but when you use the PPP in large, complex, sophisticated projects where there is a need of collaboration between different parties, where there is a need of ensuring long-term service to the customer, I think in those environments, probably the PPP fits better. It lowers the transaction costs, and I think probably it's just a tool in your toolbox. It's not the only tool you have.
Good.
Yeah,
okay, next question. As between user fees and availability payments, are you seeing any trends in the U.S. breaking down one way or the other on those issues?
I will take that one. I think at the end of the day, you were talking before about incentives.
Yeah.
And if the true value of a private development of infrastructure is the efficiencies it brings, they are closely linked to how those incentives are set. I think you can go to the maximum efficiency when you really bring into the table an incentive to increase usage, to provide the better service. And there's no other incentive to increase usage and provide a good service than a user fee, because ultimately, on a yearly basis, the user is the one who is going to decide if he wants to use a road or not, if the service is adequate, and so on. So it really brings the maximum efficiencies to the project, the usage of the user fee and the revenue risk. However, not every single project is fitted for that kind of approach. So there are many cases where improvements are needed. There are other social benefits, but simply through the user fee revenue, it's not going to be enough to finance or to fund the deal. And in those cases, I think the availability payment approach is also an approach that is going to bring a number of efficiencies, although they will not be as many as in a revenue risk deal.
I'd like to sound a sort of a brief warning on these points. I tend to agree with Nicholas's perspective. And if you were to look at the trend of P3 projects over the last 10 years in the US, there's a definite trend towards availability style transactions. And that, together with the advent of innovative financing techniques, so TIFIA, private activity bonds, etc., there is a tendency to highly leverage these projects using these innovative financing techniques. And so when it comes to investment, and what most people in this room are interested in, the equity portion, the private equity portion of the capital structure is tending to get smaller and smaller. And while that may result in lower charges or lower availability payments, it also reduces the capacity of the project to transfer risk to the private sector. So if you've only got 1 or 2% of the project at risk, question whether you're actually able to transfer risk to the private sector, because the private sector may just say, oh, well, it's not very much money, I don't need to pay attention. So I think you need to be on guard to maintain a certain amount of equity to achieve the corresponding risk transfer. And availability payments risk moving towards 100% debt transactions and having no opportunity for private investment.
Adding to that, I mean, last year, Ernst & Young, we did a report on shaping the competitive city with the Urban Land Institute. It was a global report, but it was very US dominated, where we interviewed 250 mayors from global cities across the world, and I see a very strong US presence. And the number one feature that came out of that report was, by both the public and we interviewed some private sector players as well, was number one thing to shape a competitive city was high quality infrastructure. That was a very clear trend. Interestingly, the second trend was the public's inability to pay for that infrastructure, or lack of willingness to pay for that infrastructure. So I think we've got this conundrum where everyone wants it, what's the willingness to pay, and how do we address that, and whether it's availability or not. And I think, as we discussed earlier, I think some of the things you've done in Colorado are quite innovative with the property tax. I think we really have to be more circumspect about identifying who, well, so users use the infrastructure, but who are the wider benefits accrue to? So the people that have the offices, the people that have the businesses, the surrounding property, how can we actually capture some of that revenue generation that they're getting to help cross-subsidise payment for the infrastructure? And I think a lot of work can be done there. And certainly we're seeing it, obviously in Colorado. In London, they've got a major cross-rail project which is going to go from Paddington across the city of London. And what they're doing there is they're putting 1 or 2 pence on the income tax or the property tax to help pay for it. So again, I think if you do it that way, whilst it's still a tax, people say that the tax is being paid for people who are actually ultimately benefiting from the infrastructure, because it is not a free good, as we've said earlier. So I think, again, being innovative, how you engage with the private sector, as I said earlier, scoping the project, so you don't just build a road, or you don't just build a light rail project, you're actually building an urban regeneration to say, well, what are the other benefits that can come with this, and how can we capture them at source and cross-subsidise the actual capital cost of the infrastructure? And I think, as I said, your Denver station is a classic example.
Yeah, that's exactly.
It's a win-win.
Yeah.
And we just have to, again, politically, you also have some courage to raise the property tax, but politically, we've got to have the political courage to do these things. But as long as we demonstrate the value, we should be okay.
The difficult for that one also was we had the station was clearly going to benefit a fixed part of the city, and yet the regional transportation infrastructure was being paid for by a sales tax that everyone was paying. And so those lines have been carefully drawn, so we had to do a great deal of discussions with the property owners and really get them involved and see that from their self-interest, looking at their broader self-interest, they could do much, much better if that station was spectacular. Just a good, okay, functional station was not going to increase the property value at the same level that a great station would have, and therefore that they should be happy to pay. Again, it's a fraction of a percent, right? It's a very small amount of their property tax, but commit it for some period of years to make sure that you have a spectacular station.
Governor, following up on this point, another hat that you wear is the chair of the National Governors Association. So you're talking to your colleagues quite a bit about a range of issues. How much is the public-private partnership conversation coming up among your colleagues? And are you seeing some of your other colleagues doing some interesting things to try to attract public-private partnerships?
Well, that's anytime you talk about the 50 governors and the governors of the territories, you can't generalize too well because they're very, very different people and states. I'd say probably half, maybe more than half, certainly those states that are growing or are experiencing the pressures of growth, they are fully aware and involved and committed to PPP projects. But I'd say a third to a half of the governors, even though I think it could help them generate growth, they're more cautious. And again, they're still in that wait to see. That's why I think there's a moment where it's going to happen, and all of a sudden people across this country are going to embrace and welcome the investment from around the world and say, yeah, we want to have this partnership.
Good. I wanted to ask a couple of general questions here as we start to wrap up. Looking at the U.S. landscape, I'd like to get your assessment as to whether we're more open for business from an investor's perspective today than, say, 10, 15 years ago, less, the same? What is your sense from folks that have been at this a while?
I would say much more open for business in terms of private investment in infrastructure. And while I think, as Bill said, it appears to be perhaps smaller opportunities than elsewhere in the world, it's a huge market. And so there's a small number of what appears to be relative to the country size opportunities, but actually they're pretty big. I don't know if you recall the ad for the lotteries. I'm not sure if it goes outside of New York, but they have this ad where there's big bundles of money dropping down into sort of people's front yards, but they're not going out to pick them up because it's not the $200 million lottery, it's only $30 million. So there's a lot going on, right, that you should participate in. Don't stay away because it doesn't seem to be like a tidal wave. There's certainly plenty to do.
I certainly share that view. I've been trying to develop investments in the US market for 18 years now, and it has always been challenging. I think always there was a huge pipeline of opportunities and very few materialized, so that has been common in the past. But if you take the helicopter view and you look at the trend, clearly the trend is towards more opportunities, towards streamlined regulation. I think Governor Hickenlooper, we credit you for streamlining that, imposing that transparency, and avoiding cumbersome regulation, which at the end of the day is also part of the tool to help these projects developing.
Yeah, and I would concur. I mean, there's a big prize to be had. The private sector is getting plenty of opportunity to participate, but what the private sector's got to do is continue to demonstrate where it can add value, and people like the Governor and others will have more confidence to put more projects out. They've got, as we said earlier, PPP is one set of choices they have. If the private sector continually demonstrates greater value from a PPP delivery model, clearly that will be used. But it's not the only game in town, so these guys have got to really raise the stakes.
Good. Are there any deals that are too small?
Yeah, I think there are. Most of the investors that are interested in infrastructure tend to be institutional investors, either going direct into the projects in their own name or going through funds. And so, you know, it's difficult to generalize, but $100 million of equity, while it sounds like a lot, is relatively small in the institutional investment world. And so where projects are smaller, I think opportunities to aggregate those projects is the way to go about that, in terms of what, for example, Pennsylvania is doing with its bridges and things like that. So the larger, the better. I think there's also an upper bound. You know, $10 billion is, as a total project size, is starting to get large for the private sector to be involved in. But in that $1 to $5 billion area is probably a sweet spot, Nicholas.
Yes,
for want of a better range.
I agree. There's always a challenge with transaction costs, and transaction costs are not proportional to the size of the project. It is true that very small projects probably have so large transaction costs that may not be as interesting. However, I think there is something very interesting that your department is doing with the Center of Excellence, precisely to reduce those transaction costs by extending similar approaches and similar guidelines, and that would help and allow smaller projects to be candidates for PPP.
I'd also add, sorry Bill, but to the economic development people in the room, because of this phenomenon of scale, you should be careful not to do pilot projects on a small scale. So let's test a $20 million deal and see if that works. It may not. It may actually be too small to attract interest. So make sure you start at a reasonable scale.
Yeah. There's also the opportunity. I agree with the 100 million generally, but there is also opportunity to engage with small and medium enterprises who can play at that lower level, the 50 million, and they can play a role. And I think it's important to develop that market because they need experience in the P3 model too, because ultimately they may become the subcontractors of the big guys. So they give them experience, help them develop projects. And again, from a politically and local community perspective, it's a way of gauging local contractors and local small, medium businesses to get an opportunity to participate in the P3 market.
And I would echo that, and I'd add the one thing, you know, we're doing a P3 on about 30 mile, a little less than 30 miles, I think maybe 42 kilometers between Denver and Boulder to add a heat lane. And we went through for several years, we were totally transparent. We had all the local government involved, and it's a relatively small project, not that small. But the thing we learned was that the state legislators, and I think I just throw this out there to make sure that you've got to make sure all the levels of government are included, because they had the governor involved, my predecessor, and they had all the mayors and city council members at every single community, and yet when it finally came out publicly that what the tolls were going to be and what the HOV lane would, you'd need 3 people in a vehicle instead of 2 as the old way, people went crazy and they said we were never informed. Oh my gosh, for 3 years they'd had monthly meetings with everybody informed, but the state senators and state representatives had not been informed. And these smaller, if you would do a smaller project, you would learn that lesson, I think, in a much less expensive way. Well, we still got we got the deal done, but it was a little bit tense.
So this is my last big question. Let's say you have all of the governors, all the mayors of America in this room, and you had an opportunity to talk to them about what to do to set up the best possible environment for public-private partnerships. I've heard you on having the enabling legislation, having a vision, and having the ability to sell it to the public. What other ingredients do you see as vitally important? The governor just spoke about making sure each of the levels of government are touched. What other ingredients are there?
I would say invest in your own people, build capacity within your own departments so that you can actually keep the knowledge and transfer the knowledge through the agency. Advisors come and go. We like to stay, but we typically come and go. Build capacity internally so that you can actually get that built into the organization, and then you can engage with the private sector.
I would say be bold, become a champion. We need champions because of this importance of local support and political consensus. So, and those are the people that can be those champions to develop those projects.
Yeah, I agree. Having the political champion and then having the technical infrastructure in-house to engage with the private sector are the 2 key ingredients. And the Build America Transportation Investment Center is a great model for that to be replicated around the country.
Well, we're very excited to have had this conversation, and again, I want to thank all of you for attending, and also the U.S. Department of Commerce for sponsoring, Governor Hickenlooper, Bill Blanks, Nicholas Rubio, and Chris Leslie. Thank you all very much for being part of our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.